Welcome to The Explainer. So, what if the universe wasn't just some big cosmic accident? Today, we're jumping into a really interesting 1977 sermon by Sun Myung Moon called Let Us Thank God. We're going to break down its idea of a divine blueprint for life, these surprising stages of love it talks about, and what it claims is our ultimate response to it all, gratitude.
Okay, right off the bat, the sermon makes this huge claim. Creation was not an accident. It says that everything we see, isn't random at all. It's the result of a deliberate act, a pre-existing plan. You could call it a divine blueprint.
Okay, so if there's a blueprint, then what's the point of it all? What's the goal? Well, that brings us to the first big idea here. The universe was designed with a very specific end in mind. And, get this, according to the sermon, that end is us, humanity. You know, the text makes this really fascinating point here. It's not just that the universe was made for us. It argues it was made from us, like we were the model. What that means is that our own personal history, in a way, is a mirror of the history of the whole cosmos. So we're not just living in the universe, we're a reflection of it. Kind of wild, right?
So, this whole idea of a planned universe, it naturally leads to a huge, fundamental question, right? Which came first, matter or consciousness? And the sermon uses this exact question to set up a big contrast between its own view and another competing worldview.
All right, so here's how the sermon lays out these two clashing worldviews. On one side, you have the idea that a universal mind, a consciousness, planned everything. That means purpose came before existence. On the other side, you've got a view rooted in what's called dialectical materialism, where matter comes first and the universe just sort of evolves randomly through conflict. And it's super important to remember the context here. This was 1977, right in the middle of the Cold War. The sermon flat out links that second view to communist ideology.
Okay, so if the universe is planned, how does it actually move forward? How does it progress? Well, the sermon introduces what it calls a fundamental law that governs, well, everything. It's called the principle of interaction.
So what is this principle? The text argues that for any real progress to happen, you always need at least two distinct elements. It doesn't matter if it's the spiritual and the physical, or men and women, they have to come together in a relationship, working towards a higher common goal.
And once you start looking for it, this drive to unite is, according to the sermon, everywhere. It points to things like art, literature, human relationships. All of it is seen as evidence of this universal desire to create harmony. It's all about moving toward a higher purpose through this constant give-and-take dynamic.
Now, this whole principle of interaction, where does it all lead? It finds its ultimate, most perfect expression in what the sermon describes as the entire purpose of life itself, and that is, of course, love.
So why love? Why is it so central to this whole framework? Well, the sermon argues that love is the engine. It's the thing that connects all of our actions, our relationships, our entire existence, back to that big, universal purpose we've been talking about.
And according to the text, really understanding this kind of love is a journey, a three-stage journey to be exact. First, as kids, we learn about love by receiving it. Then, as adults, we experience what it calls spousal love. That's more of a horizontal give and take between partners. And finally, we get to the highest form, parental love. That's the sacrificial, totally giving, vertical love for a child. And this quote really gets to the heart of why that three-stage journey matters so much. The sermon is basically saying that God designed the family structure this way on purpose, so that we could finally grasp His nature as a parent, because we've actually lived it ourselves.
And that's why, according to the sermon, parental love is just so incredibly powerful. It represents a vertical and unbreakable connection. The text even uses the example of divorce, pointing out that even when that horizontal love between spouses breaks down, parents will cling to their children. Why? Because that vertical love just feels absolutely irreplaceable.
Okay, so let's recap. If the whole point of life is to go on this journey to experience this divine three-stage love, then what are we supposed to do about it? What's our response? The sermon has a very clear answer: a life of profound and constant gratitude.
The sermon argues that we are, and this is a direct quote, a chunk of indebtedness. Basically, we owe our existence to God, to our parents, to nature itself. And when you look at it that way, the only response that makes sense is constant gratitude, not just for the little things, but for the very fabric of our existence.
And the text really encourages you to look past the small, everyday stuff and be thankful for the huge fundamental elements that make life even possible. These are presented as direct gifts from God, things we totally take for granted every single day. The sun, the air we breathe, our bodies, even our ability to love. They're all framed as the greatest gifts we could ever receive.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because we're told that gratitude isn't just some passive feeling you have. No, according to this sermon, it demands action. The only way we can actually repay the universe for all the gifts we've received is by giving back, by serving others. All right, this brings us to our final section. This is where all these huge ideas, purpose, love, gratitude, they all come together and build towards a really powerful call to action. The text uses this pretty striking analogy of a fish. Now, a fish that gets caught for food, you might think its life was just cut short, right? But the sermon argues that if that fish dies for a higher cause, say, to become the flesh and blood of God-centered people, then its life has actually been perfected. And then, that exact same principle is applied directly to human life. The idea is that if a person's entire life is given for what the sermon calls the supreme love of the universe, which is defined as the love of God, then even the moment of death becomes a joyous, happy event.
To really drive this point home, the sermon presents its audience with a pretty stark choice. It's a question that's really designed to frame the ultimate commitment that this whole sermon has been building up to.
And that leaves us with the final, very provocative question that the sermon puts to its audience. It's a question that really ties everything we've talked about together, this idea of a universe with a purpose, a life defined by love, a responsive act of gratitude, all leading to this one point: the willingness to make the ultimate sacrifice. It is a powerful and definitely challenging conclusion to this divine blueprint for life.